correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
Does Dr. Phil have a point? It depends on your perspective. If you look at what he's saying from a white supremacist perspective, he does. White supremacy meaning that the whites are superior and therefore should be able to dominate and rule non-whites. From that perspective, it follows that acts against non-whites in such a system shouldn't disqualify a person from their other recognizable accomplishments. This is the position that Dr. Phil is viewing it from a white supremacy perspective, whether he realizes it or not. And it's not just Dr. Phil, it's a lot of people who adopt this position. Dr. Phil tries to smuggle in a concept when he says,
if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism.
You catch that? He says if you're wanting to change American history by pretending these people did not exist, he's smuggling in this absurd idea that history somehow changes. And the reason he's doing this, in my opinion, is that it gets people angry. People don't want to change history, but that's not what's happening. When talking about this, I often bring up Adolf Hitler. I do this to illustrate the ridiculousness of this perspective. As an example, should there be schools named after Adolf Hitler? I mean, he did more than just orchestrate the Holocaust, right? He did other good things. So let's say, for example, that the Germans, for some odd reason, sometime after World War II, had a school named after Adolf Hitler. And let's also say, for the sake of this discussion, at some later point, they decide to change the name of the school. Would that act of changing the name of the school simultaneously change German history? Of course it wouldn't. We name schools after people to honor them. If those same people had accomplishments outside of atrocities that they may have committed, then those accomplishments would be recorded in the history books where they belong. We don't want to confuse being honored with anything other than being honored. That example he gave about speeding is so stupid it's painful. We aren't talking about simply breaking the law as he seems to suggest. We're talking about crimes against humanity. In both cases, slavery and the Holocaust, we're talking about crimes against specific groups of people, violent crimes. We hear that and we understand this simple concept immediately. At least we should. The real question is, when it comes to the plight of black people in this country, why do those same scenarios become so cloudy? Why is it so easy to dismiss the atrocities that were done here to blacks? That's the real question.